and welcome to my channel. Have a look at this. And today I'm going to be filming for you my November 2016 wrap-up video because 2016 is going so fast and it's advent calendar month already, as I like to call December. I didn't get too much reading done in the month of November. There was a lot of TV to be watched and essays to be written for school this month, but I did manage to get in 3 books and 1 play, which I didn't think was bad considering all the schoolwork and all the TV that my eyeballs were plastered on this month. And I thoroughly enjoyed the books and play that I did read, so I'm quite happy with the selection that I've got here. So let's discuss. The first book I read this month was Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. So Crooked Kingdom is the second book in the Six of Crows duology, which is set in the same world as the Grisha trilogy, Leigh Bardugo's other trilogy is. However, unlike the Grisha trilogy, the Six of Crows duology is based in the city of Ketterdam, which is sort of like a thriving port that feels like a mix of Amsterdam and Victorian London, and it's got a really big sort of criminal underbelly to the world, which is where our main character, Kaz Brecker, comes from. So in the first book, Six of Crows, Kaz is given this impossible heist to carry out, and Crooked Kingdom sort of looks at the fallout of that. And I can't really go too much into the plot of this book without spoiling the first one, but if you haven't read the first one, I would thoroughly recommend you go and do that, and then you go and read this one. I also want to say you don't have to read the Grisha trilogy to read this series. I read the first book in the Grisha trilogy and I wasn't keen, but the premise of this one was really interesting to me, so I picked it up anyway, and I enjoyed it so much. That's kind of a personal thing. I know a lot of people really loved the Grisha trilogy, but I do feel that Leigh Bardugo sort of just upped every aspect of her storytelling with this series, and it was so wonderful. I was really nervous going into this book because I didn't know how she would manage to wrap everything up neatly, or at least satisfactorily in one book, but she did, and she did it really well. I still feel as though it was maybe too much story for one book. I feel like she could have quite easily extended it to 1 or maybe 2 more books, but that didn't really lessen my enjoyment. It just kind of made it hurt more when it finished, because I would have loved another book to have been able to spend more time with these characters because they're such excellent characters. Unlike in Six of Crows, every member of Kaz's gang, so 6 people, have a point of view in Crooked Kingdom, but Leigh Bardugo does such an excellent point of defining each voice really clearly. I think my favourite character is still probably Kaz. I love him. He's so morally questionable. He's an anti-hero in the truest sense. But I also really loved other characters. Wylan, who we didn't get to hear from in the first book, had the most adorable point of view, but he was also really sneaky. He was like a baby Kaz Brecker, and I loved it so much. I also really like how Leigh Bardugo has these really emotional moments and addresses these really deep topics, yet still manages to balance it out with humour and not have it feel as though she's laughing anything off or not explore anything in the depth that it deserves to be explored in. Something I really wanted to mention in this review is the way that she handles PTSD in these books. Just seemed absolutely amazing. I personally don't have any experience with that problem, but I felt as though she was handling everything very sensitively, and the sort of things that I was afraid of happening and that I feel happens a lot when mental health is portrayed in books, particularly to do with the intersection of mental health and romance, and how a mentally ill person has a romance and what impact that has on mental health. I felt as though she dealt with that really well, and she never just kind of brushed off those issues in favour of a romance, and I really appreciated that. So yes, I would thoroughly recommend this duology, and I gave this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, the play I read this month was A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. A Streetcar Named Desire follows a young woman called Blanche Dubois. Blanche and her sister Stella are both from what was quite a rich southern family. They owned a plantation called Belle Reve in the south, but that plantation has recently been lost, which means that Blanche, who no longer has any money, has come to stay with Stella and Stella's husband Stanley in New Orleans. However, Stanley's ideas and views about the world sharply contrast with those of Blanche, and that kind of teamed up with the layer of secrecy that Blanche keeps around her past just breeds a lot of conflict, and that's really where the play takes off. I'm studying this play with school at the moment, which is why I read it, and it's probably one of my favourite things that I've ever studied, just ever. I feel like what Tennessee Williams does amazingly, possibly better than any playwright I've ever read, is give the characters such distinct portraits and voices. And what I mean by that is from within pages of meeting these characters, who they were was just so clearly defined in my mind. You can see them, you understand them. It was like unbelievable just how much he managed to characterize those characters in like such a short play. I felt like I understood these characters better than I understand characters in many like full-length long novels that I read, which is pretty amazing. I also really like the emphasis that he put on kind of the other aspects of drama. Tennessee Williams is really famous for having these super detailed stage directions. Like, he incorporates aspects to do with music and lighting a lot in those stage directions, and I love that because I felt like I was seeing the little production in my mind. It was really sensory and wonderful to read about. I also really like that sort of theme of culture clash that he introduced. I think it's something that's still really relevant in the world today, and I loved watching Blanche's kind of old South mentality clash with Stanley's sort of new American mentality. I thought that made for such like excellent dramatic tension. I honestly think that this is one of my favourite plays that I've ever read, if not the favourite play that I've ever read. I thought it was excellent, and if you're looking to get more into drama, as I started to this year, I would definitely recommend this one as a starting point. And I ended up giving A Streetcar Named Desire 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I turned back to YA, I turned back to fantasy, and I decided to pick up A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J Maas. So this is also the second book in this series, the first book being A Court of Thorn and Roses, which is a sort of Beauty and the Beast retelling that incorporates some sort of Hades and Persephone elements into it. It's set in a world where there's Fae and there are humans, and the divide between them is really fierce. And Feyre is a human who in the first book went and stayed with one of the High Lords of one of the many courts that the fairies have in the Feyland. Nice summarising there, Jess. So Feyre goes through unbelievable trials and tribulations in the first book, and again we're really looking at that kind of literal, political, but also mental fallout in this novel, and some other characters that were very minor in the first book start coming back into it and just really like amping up the entire series. I wasn't really a big fan of the first book in the series. I felt like the characters weren't really well fleshed out. I felt like the world itself was just really limited because we only ever got to see like tiny little bits of it out of the entire like huge region that Sarah J Maas had created. So I was really uncertain about going into this one because I didn't want to just set myself up for disappointment, but honestly this was miles better than the first one. Sarah J Maas always like just amazes me with her ability to just step things up massively every time she goes a book further in a series. Feyre, our main character Feyre, her character development over the course of this novel was just A++. It was absolutely amazing. She goes from someone who's just so defeated and someone who I personally feel lacked character to just such an admirable person. It was incredible, like the way that Sarah J Maas handled that characterization. I also loved the new cast of characters that we got in this book. That's another thing that I think Sarah J Maas does well in all of her novels, is have a really great cast of characters and a really good idea of how all their dynamics work together. I also loved getting to see more of the world. In book one, we're restricted very much to a couple of locations, where in this one you get a much better idea of the world as a whole, of the politics of that world, and I just felt that this was a much better fleshed out fantasy novel. There were a few issues I had with it, and it's hard to talk about them without going into spoilery territory, but kind of in vague terms, I felt as if there were some changes that happened too abruptly in the sort of first third. Like, I felt Feyre's mindset changed very quickly, and I understood why it changed, but I felt like it would have been better if Sarah J Maas had given her more time to maybe come to realizations that she came to. I sound so cryptic right now. I also felt, and this is quite a controversial point with this book, a lot of people disagree on this, that some characters from the first book were not in character for a good chunk of this book, and that was a personal opinion of mine. I do feel as though Sarah J Maas sometimes will maybe vilify a character if she wants the audience to latch onto another character, and that's not a criticism at all, because I do think that's something that's quite easy to do when a character's headspace is changing, but it was something that I also felt happened too abruptly and needed more build up than we got. And the final thing, which I feel a little bit awkward talking about on this channel, is that in terms of romance, I really don't like Sarah J Maas's scenes of intimate nature. Shall we call them that? Yes, I'm not a fan of those. And it's not that they are sex scenes, because I don't have a problem with those in books, and it's not even that they're graphic, because that's also fine. It's just the way that she writes them, and this is going to sound really horrible, but it's like really awfully written smutty fan fiction, or at least that's just how I found it, and I feel really bad saying it because I know a lot of people love Sarah J Maas's romantic scenes, but for me they just bordered a little bit on the I don't know, overdone, overwritten. Yeah, it was just a thing for me that maybe meant that scenes that I should have been able to think, oh yay, characters, coupling, just I cringed and skim read a lot of them, and which was sad because I love romance in books and I felt like I didn't get to fully enjoy this one because of some of those scenes. But like I say, that is a personal thing. You might feel completely differently, so don't let that put you off reading this book. But yeah, I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I was really pleasantly surprised. And the final book I read this month, also actually for school, was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And I just want to like talk about this cover. This is the most gorgeous cover of The Handmaid's Tale that I've ever seen. Like the colours and just the art, it's so beautiful. So The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopian tale, and it follows the story of a woman who has been given the name Offred in this sort of society where essentially the rights of women, the rights of the majority of minorities, has been like hugely reduced. And in this society, Offred is a handmaid, which essentially means that her role is to provide children for infertile and higher up couples, and should she fail to do this after 3 attempts, she is then sent to a nuclear wasteland known as the colonies, where she will essentially die. It's really a cautionary tale, I think, of the political climate that Margaret Atwood was writing in, and I would also argue that if you turn on the news and look outside now, that there are bits of this that are really kind of warning us of the political climate that the world's in, like today in 2016, which was really scary when reading this for the second time. But putting terrifying political climates aside, this book, I absolutely love it. And I feel like it's a really weird thing to say that, because this isn't the sort of book that you love. You don't read this and feel good on the inside. It's a very stark, very unflinching kind of look at society, at bigotry, at just a lot of really awful things. It's something that impacts me so powerfully every single time I read it. It was one of my favourite books of last year, and I think the reason I love it so much is because it has the power to just chill me, just to the core. I just feel so unbelievably shaken and nervous every time after I read this book. It's just, it impacts me on such a deep emotional level. She also uses language a lot, Margaret Atwood. She looks at saying, she looks at words and phrases and manipulation, and I really like the way that language kind of played into this book. I feel like it plays into a lot of dystopian books with things like 1984. Of course, I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. So those were all the books that I read in November this year. It's really weird to think that the next time I make one of these wrap-up videos, like Christmas would have come and gone, and I will probably have a lot more books to read, which is really exciting. But until then, I would love to hear what sort of books you read this month, so let me know below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.